Okay, so here we are continuing our discussion of Freud, and maybe a good place to start is wondering why so much sex? Why is Freud so focused on sex? And I think one quick answer to that is that Freud lived in a culture in which sex was well, sex wasn't forbidden, but talking about sex was, and there were lots of rules around sex, and certainly especially for women, lots of rules about whether they could be sexual or not. And so that is part of the reason why there's so much focus, is that in a society where there are so many rules about sex, then sex becomes a good target for repression and denial and those defense mechanisms and unconscious motivation that we talked about earlier, right? That cauldron seething cauldron of unacceptable wishes, impulses, and desires, sex becomes a really easy component of that cauldron, right? Lots of it is unacceptable. But the other, and I think more important reason why sex becomes so important to Freud is that if we're talking about um, people coming up against the social world, then sex becomes something where we have to make compromises in order to be socially appropriate or acceptable. So Freud talked a lot about instincts, and at the time that was an acceptable word to use, but now we no longer use the word instincts to describe human behavior because we don't have complex instinctual behavior like nest building that birds have. But maybe a better word to use rather than instinct is appetite. And so to think about appetites that we might have, appetites that might be more likely at some places in life than other places, and that these appetites, the purpose of these appetites is always to create a sense of pleasure, to reduce tension, to create a sense of homeostasis. And homeostasis is balance. The idea of us being in a comfortable place. And in that way, if we have these appetites, right? So we might have an appetite for food or for water or for companionship or for other things. But sex is the only appetite that is always connected to a social relationship. That when we are seeking sex, we're seeking sex with somebody else. And in that way, it is more complicated and also involves, by its definition, coming up against the social world. Right? We can get food without coming up against the social world, at least at times. But with sex, that's not a possibility. And so it's probably why it's so important to Freud's theory. It's probably also why sex winds up connected to disruptive behavior so much. So people who have behavior that we see as disrupted because they're engaging in too much sex or they're anxious about sex, and not just sex, but all of what comes with or leads up to sex, so romantic relationships, etc., appearance-related things, if that's sexual in nature, so sex becomes important only because of the nature of how we fulfill that need, and not because of sex per se. Um, so, right, but we do have these psychosexual stages. So that word sex is right in there, and this is for Freud the progression through which personality gets developed. And we already talked about the idea of the child, the individual coming up against the social world. And this is as the child tries to satisfy their own appetites. So the child at birth in the first year of life, right, the main appetite is an actual physical hunger and a food appetite, and the child just wants to be nurtured all of the time. So it's food, it's nurtured, I want to be held, right? So the infant wants to be held all the time, wants to be fed, wants just to be taken care of all the time. Those are the appetites of that first year of life. And then immediately or very soon after birth, the child needs to start managing the fact that it has to wait sometimes, that mom may not be immediately available to feed the child, that no one may be available to pick them up immediately. But that's the appetite of the first year of life. And as we're going to look at in just a moment, that the main focus appetite changes depending on the age of the child and the pieces of the social world they're interacting with, right? And so the piece of the social world the child interacting with at one is different than what they may be interacting with or have opportunity to interact with at 2 or 3, 4 or 5. But essentially what we're talking about here is that the child comes into the world wanting pleasure, and then the social world sets up obstacles to having that pleasure. And those obstacles are often the relationships, the other people around them that are presenting the obstacles. And so that's what we're going to focus on as we look at each of the stages. So I think this is a really good chart. I think it would be really useful for most of you to print out just this slide with this chart on it. But what I want to point out is a couple of things. Way too often, Freud's psychosexual stages are overly simplified. And just focusing on physical outcomes. And so somebody, as you can see, this result of the fixation, that too often this becomes about, somebody who eats too much because they have a problem at the oral stage. And while it is an oral stage and while that appetite is certainly food at that stage, the problems that result if things aren't resolved well at one or the other of these stages is not just about a literal interpretation of that stage. It's about, if we come back up here, the issues of the stage, which are not necessarily concrete and literal. So let's go through these one by one and talk about what I mean. So the first stage is that oral stage. So hopefully you guys have read this in the book, and this is these terms are familiar. So is the oral stage, right? That's the first year of life. It's the example I gave in the last slide. The issue at this stage is nurture and dependency. That if you think about what does the child want in the first year of life, what is their pleasure? It's about being held. It's about being fed. It's about having their physical needs immediately taken care of. And the ways that things can go wrong here is, in terms of this, what leads to fixation, is that the child can either be given too little of that attention, and so that need is not met, or they are never required, right? If what's important in development is coming up against the social world and negotiating that, then if the parent just gives them everything that they need, the child never has to wait, they're never weaned, they're never, then that is not great either, right? If the child is never forced to come up against the social world, then no development is happening from a Freudian point of view. And so the result of fixation, either because needs weren't met and the child continues to have that appetite unmet, or that the needs were always met and the child never has to negotiate, how do I delay gratification, we wind up with what Freud called an oral personality. And that may be about eating too much or chewing on pencils, but more importantly, it is about being dependent. It is about having struggles with dependency, and that could be being too dependent on people, always expecting them to meet all of your needs, or always continuing to seek out having unmet needs met. Or it could be somebody who has trouble ever letting themselves be dependent. But either way, it's about an incomplete or an insufficient negotiation with how do I manage what I want in terms of dependency and what people are willing to give me. And an ideal solution to this oral stage is having a sense of being able to negotiate or navigate that. The anal stage, right, is 2 to 3 years. And again, this is about what shifts here is the social world and what demands it makes on the child. There aren't a lot of demands other than waiting that are put onto the child in the first year of life. But starting at age 2, we now have a child at 2 to 3 years old where the social world is starting to up the ante a little bit. And so the social world now is expecting the child to negotiate control. And so 2-year-old's favorite word, for anyone who's been around a 2-year-old, is no. That is the child understanding suddenly that they can exert control. And as the child understands they can exert control, then what they're coming up against is the social world that says, no, you can't always be in control. Sometimes I'm going to be in control. So you can say no to me, but I'm going to also say no to you. And I'm going to expect you to have control sometimes over your own behavior. And so we start as a society expecting the child to be able to show self-control in some ways. And the easiest way to observe that is through potty training. That potty training is a really nice example, though not the only example, of how we expect 2 to 3-year-old children to exert control over themselves, to be able to anticipate when they have to use the bathroom, to be able to hold it until they can get to the bathroom. And the child, what's coming up against, the child doesn't want to have to, like the child's pleasure is just going to the bathroom when they want to, right? So this is a good example of it. But there's all kinds of ways we expect children to show control. We expect them not to have temper tantrums. We expect them to be able to ask for what they want rather than just taking what they want. We start teaching them to say please and thank you, right? All of these things are self-control. And if a parent either allows a child to have too much control, where the child is kind of rules the roost. Then the child again is not having to navigate, negotiate that coming up against the social world, and they fail to develop parts of their personality that should result from having to navigate that and negotiate that. Or if the child is given too little control, where the parent just runs roughshod over them and gives them no choices. Similarly, the child gets no opportunity to navigate and negotiate, how do I manage what I want, what control I want, and what control I will give, right? And so that's how fixation happens. And what Freud called an anal retentive or an anal expulsive personality, because he focused on this anal thing. But really, this is about either a person who comes into the world either exerting too much control all of the time and failing to see where they have to give control sometimes, or a person who cedes all control. They don't try to exert any control, and therefore always lets other people be in control, or doesn't try to control their own life in any way. But both of those things are the result of not having the opportunity to learn to negotiate control. Okay, and that is the really important thing. I'm going to stop this video here because of the time, and I want to keep these under a certain time, but we're going to pick up in the next video talking about the phallic stage.